It's Gadi, Schwartz, and tonight we are staying on top of all these fast and furious cuts being made to the federal government this week. We saw potentially hundreds of thousands of federal jobs eliminated, including some in defense. So what's that going to mean to our national security? We're going to get into that. Plus, some late-breaking changes to the U.S. Army's transgender policy. It is now barring those who identify as transgender from enlisting. And that's coming as protests brew in front of the Stonewall Inn over changes to its website. NBC's Stephen Romo is on the scene with more. And we are now up to seven DOJ prosecutors that have quit because of how the case against the New York City mayor is being handled. They are saying it's playing out as quid pro quo that favors the Trump administration's immigration policy. Here's what it sounds like.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
Yeah, those are just some of the stories we're following tonight. There's a lot more to unpack, so let's get going, because this is Stay Tuned Now. And tonight, we've got some new reporting here at NBC News on those thousands of layoffs and firings in the federal government, and word that there are possibly even bigger mass layoffs coming after this first wave. Now, take a look at this. These are the agencies, all of the agencies. The Office of Personnel Management, basically the government's human resources department, told all probationary employees must be fired, meaning anyone who hasn't had their civil service protections kicked in. Now, we don't know the total because we are being told that the final tallies are not due until Tuesday of next week, but we do know that thousands have been fired, from people that work at NASA to some at the Department of Energy who help safeguard our nuclear weapons arsenal. And when it is all said and done, these firings alone could impact more than 200,000 people. Again, just this wave alone, which would be upwards of about 10% of the entire federal workforce, which could possibly swing the unemployment rate in the whole country. But at least at one agency, a pause has been put into place by a federal judge who temporarily blocked mass firings at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, saying those workers cannot be fired without cause for now. The White House did not immediately respond to a request for comment on that ruling. Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard on this Friday night. Vaughn, before we dive in here, let's separate all this out, because it is hard to wrap your mind around how big this is. These firings are separate from what we're seeing at DOGE, right?
Right. These firings here are orders that came to every single agency saying probationary employees, folks that have been there for less than 2 years, should be terminated. That essentially, during that probationary phase there, that's right before your civil service worker protections kick in. And what we have seen are thousands of individuals who are terminated early on in their jobs from these positions. But in some cases, like the CDC, for instance, that's 1/10 of the workforce. And I was just talking with one of those workers who was terminated by the Department of Energy, who acknowledged that, yes, in fact, for example, that a deferred resignation plan was offered. Essentially, you can resign and get paid through September. That was an offer that was presented by the Trump administration. But in the case of this worker, they wanted the federal job that they held. And so they bypassed that opportunity. And just about 1 week later, were formally terminated without severance here. So the ramifications for those workers who have been laid off are big, but also we're hearing from folks that are still in these agencies. I was talking to somebody from the Forest Service, Gadi, who told me that they lost several people in their office. And so it's not just those who have lost their jobs, but also operationally speaking, it's now figuring out how to proceed, especially with the questions of whether there are more individuals that are going to be terminated next.
And I know some of the graphics we've been showing, some of the information we've been getting is piecemeal, where we know a few thousand here, 1,000 over there. Right. But the full scope of this, I mean, by our counts so far, and again, this is very preliminary, looks like it's about 6,000 to 8,000 that we can account for. But how big could this be, and when are we going to get some actual numbers and actual savings?
Right. We believe that the number of probationary employees is about 200,000. And I was talking with a source familiar who said that, in fact, the Office of Personnel Management under the Trump administration went to every agencies and ordered them to terminate these employees. So we're looking at a sizable chunk of the federal workforce here by this weekend, next week even, being terminated here. And of course, then the question is, are there more to come? We have heard them talking about trying to dismantle the Department of Education. We have seen that happen to USAID, as well as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There are potentially other targets as well. Even President Trump suggested cuts potentially to the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, in terms of personnel. So I think that we are just at these beginning stages based off of the suggestions that have been made by Elon Musk and President Trump.
And we're just at the beginning. Meanwhile, there are a whole lot of lawsuits flying right now, filed to try to stop this. Can they?
That's going to be the outstanding question. One of those lawsuits was brought by 14 state attorneys general, and the lawsuit makes the assertion and the claim that the DOGE is not a true formal agency and that it should have to have the approval of Congress to have been created, and that Elon Musk is acting unconstitutionally in such a sweeping manner as this without having been confirmed by the Senate. Of course, all of this will work its way through the courts. There's a litany of other lawsuits that are taking place that have paused some of the firings, some of the furloughs, some of the terminations. But this is clearly a Trump administration that is looking to make good on a promise to cut down the federal workforce. And we have heard, folks from both parties for decades say they wanted to trim the size of the federal government. But there are some critics, not just Democrats, but some Republicans, that are making the case that these are just sweeping cuts and not necessarily targeted efforts to trim the budget and trim personnel. Instead, in the case of these probationary employees, for instance, Gadi, it has nothing to do on merit or their performance reviews. It's just all of them all at once.
And Trump, I mean, he campaigned on making America great again for the American working class. No matter how you slice it, this is going to be a lot of jobs lost, tens of thousands of jobs, potentially more than 100,000. Is there a difference between the working class and the government working class?
I think it's a really good question, Gadi. We've heard Elon Musk talk about the bureaucracy and suggest that the bureaucracy has overtaken the democracy. That is the line and the impetus Elon Musk and others have said is the reason for going and trying to cut down the size of the federal government workforce. And oftentimes it's thought of that all federal workers are in Washington, D.C. Of course, the federal workers that are watching us right now are most likely not living in the greater Washington, D.C. area. 80% of the federal workforce are outside of the D.C. area. From Arizona, Colorado, Washington, you can name the agency. Their footprint are in a great many places around the country here. And so I think there's questions, of course, when you're looking at potential unemployment, but also the long-term consequences and also the immediate impact that these families undoubtedly are having as they lose their jobs.
And Vaughn, existentially, this is a difficult question, but so much of what we're seeing feels like what happens to a company that's about to declare bankruptcy, but on a scale that we've never seen before. Big picture, like, is this a poison pill, or is there a chance that this could work?
I think that it was Donald Trump that suggested, the president suggested that there may be short-term pains, potentially higher prices, along with his tariff policies that he's looking to implement here. But they're making the case that there's going to be long-term gain. I think that there's a lot of questions when it comes agency to agency, department to department, about exactly what that looks like. Yet at the same time, we're looking at, just 3 weeks into this administration, a mass overhaul of the federal government in ways that we have not seen before. And it's really tough to predict what the consequences of that will be. At the same time, there is consternation from those around the country. I can tell you that there was one federal worker based out in Colorado who I was just talking with this evening, who is still employed, but her husband just lost a construction job. And they believe that that was because of policies related to the Trump administration's tariff proposals and concern about a drawback in construction projects. So there's a lot of questions about Medicaid, the future of Medicare, and I think all of those are coming to a head at once. The president is making the case that this is going to be good for the country, but of course there are critics that are suggesting that there are going to be sizable consequences, not only in the immediate, but also in the long term.
And there are a lot of people and a lot of families out there that are trying to figure out how they are going to pay the bills going forward. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, thank you so much. Now, beyond all this, there are rumblings of massive cuts coming to how we spend money on national defense. And some of the talk in the Oval Office seems to be ricocheting all around the world, even impacting Wall Street and some of the biggest defense companies on the planet. So let's bring in Michael O'Hanlon. He is the Philip H. Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy and the Director of Research, the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael. A lot going on in the world tonight, a lot of it happening behind the scenes right now. But I'm still thinking about that moment where we saw the president seem to suggest that we have been spending too much on defense. Russia's been spending too much on defense. China's been spending too much on the defense. Like, it was kind of a wild moment there. But what do you think that signals? And do you think we're going to see large-scale cuts soon?
Wow, what a question. And, let me start with something I can put my hands around a little more easily. On all we've heard about Ukraine in the last 3 or 4 days, I'm going to start by trying to say something nice about the Trump administration. I think the sum total of what President Trump and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth have said, largely in Europe this week, has added up to a pretty decent beginning of a strategy for how to try to put pressure on all the different key parties to end that war and still protect Ukraine and its sovereignty. So it's a long ways from any actual negotiation or success. Trump does like Putin too much, but nonetheless, some of the ideas there are pretty good. By contrast, I cannot begin to fathom what he's talking about in regard to some of these defense budget cuts. We don't even agree on what China and Russia actually spend on their military. You can't measure or verify that. Let's go back to Ronald Reagan's concept, trust but verify. You're not going to get into a negotiation with Russia and China where they just promise to cut their budget by some unmeasurable amount and you actually believe them. So this is sort of just, it would be fun barroom banter. And it's not a bad place to start a wide-ranging conversation about defense spending, but it's not a serious policy proposal. And on top of that, as you've been reporting and discussing just now, the capriciousness with which some of these federal employee cuts are being imposed on other agencies bodes in a very troubling way for DOD and the intelligence community, which is, as you know, within the Department of Defense budget. We need these agencies to be strong. We can't afford the same kind of capriciousness towards them as we've seen in recent days towards other agencies.
And yet some of the criticism of the cuts that we're seeing right now and the capricious nature, if there is one there, is that like, oh, it's not that big of a part of the budget overall. And yet, when it comes to defense has always been a target by both the left and the right for allegations of overspending and fraud and waste and abuse and all that stuff. And if I understand correctly, like anywhere from 13 to 15% of the U.S. budget has gone to the military. Do you think that's going to change? Because that is a huge target.
It is a huge target, and there's a lot of waste at the Pentagon. 13 to 15% is a lot less than it used to be. It was 25% under Reagan. It was 50% in the 1950s and 60s. So, this is a big chunk of money, but it is not the primary problem we have with our fiscal policy today. And on top of that, I just don't see which particular elements of this are going to be easily harvested for savings. Let me give you one quick example. Base closures. We still have more bases in the United States than we need. We closed a lot through base closure processes in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. But a good rule of thumb for closing bases, let's say closing a few dozen, is that it takes you 5 years to get any savings at all because you've got to actually do environmental remediation and conversion. And even after you do that, you save maybe $3 billion a year. Now, that's still real money, but it's $3 billion out of $900 billion. So those are the ways you have to look for savings in the defense budget. They don't come quickly and they don't come easily. And you can find them. You should find them. There is waste, but it's sort of marbled into the muscle. And if you just try to lop it off, you're going to cut away a lot of crucial military capability at the same time.
Marbled into the muscle is a perfect way to describe so much of this. I mean, bases are one thing. One thing that has also been on the horizon, though, is modernizing and in some case pivoting away from like the high dollar exquisite systems, aircraft carriers, like next generation fighters. And we started to see that happen under Biden, where they were paying way more attention to ramping up autonomous, cheaper, as they call them, like attritable systems to match China and Russia and their drones. Do you think that is going to be supercharged here? possibly away from the prime contractors that we're used to?
Yeah, we should move in that direction to some extent, but only to some extent, because let me just talk about China and Taiwan. As you know, one of our big military fears, maybe our number one fear, is that China will someday try to attack Taiwan to force it to reunify with the motherland. Well, if China tries an amphibious assault, all these drones and autonomous vehicles may be the best answer we have, based on Okinawa or undersea, underwater vehicles, what have you, because they can make a mess out of any big ships trying to cross the Taiwan Strait. So that one plays to our advantage using robotics and drones. On the other hand, if China tries to blockade Taiwan by simply trying to shoot missiles and maybe use submarines to attack ships coming into Taiwan, then we need to actually defend against drones ourselves, because we're going to have to create a safe shipping corridor to try to break that blockade. And all the sort of challenges that work to our advantage in the invasion scenario become problems in the blockade or counter-blockade scenario. The problem with the United States is we have so many allies and interests that if we try to simplify the future of war into just one scenario and just one technology, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work at all. I mean, this conversation could go on for so long, and I hope you'll come back, because these are important conversations and we need to have them. But there's so much going on. We're already past our time here. But Michael, thank you so much for breaking all this down. And please come back. We didn't even get into ICBMs or any of that. So thanks for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
As for what's happening in the military tonight, there is some breaking news out of the U.S. Army. They say that they will no longer allow transgender people to join, and this is happening as the Trump administration also got rid of references to transgender and queer people from the official website of the Stonewall National Monument, a place that has given birth to the modern gay rights movement.
Right behind me is a rally and protest at the Stonewall National Monument here in New York City.
We are loved.
We are loved. I'm trans, and I'm not going anywhere.
We will not let you erase the existence of our trans siblings.
That's right. They will not erase us.
That was the reaction today, and it's not just the words transgender and queer that are gone, but also the T and the Q plus and LGBTQ plus. Now, the government-run website now only references lesbian, gay, and bisexual civil rights. And Stonewall, that was designated a historic site in 2016 under President Obama. It was the first national monument dedicated to the LGBTQ plus rights and history. And Stephen Romo joins us now. Stephen, are the folks over at the Stonewall National Monument or Park Service given any reason for the website changes?
Yeah, Gadi, this really just seems to be more of the same. We've seen this on the State Department website 2 weeks ago, them doing the exact same thing, removing the TQ plus from LGBTQ plus that used to be on their website. The difference here, and the reason it hits harder at the Stonewall National Monument, is how integral trans people were to the movement that kicked off what is known as what sparked the gay rights movement as we know it in the United States now. Many people that were here today protesting, saying that exact same thing, that erasing part of history just does not make sense and will not happen. So many people standing up and saying that they refuse to be erased, Gadi.
How did the trans activism play into the Stonewall uprisings?
Yeah, a great question, Gadi. Whenever you look back at what actually happened in 1969 that kicked off the gay rights movement as we know it, there was Marsha P. Johnson, and there was Sylvia Rivera, who did so much. They were prominent figures, part of what happened here outside of the Stonewall Inn back in 1969. So to remove the TQ plus from this history reading through, it's not like the State Department, which is giving advice to people traveling. This is about the history of what took place here. So people say that it's just clearly an effort to erase trans people, something that we've heard for a long time from leaders in the gay rights movement, say that they thought that it could happen as it happened in the past. They thought it could happen again. Here's more of actually what's been said from these people who made all this change happen in the first place.
Oh, it was so exciting. It was like, we're doing it. We're doing it. We're their nerves. The cops were, they just panicked. When I got downtown, the place was already on fire and it was a raid already. The riots had already started, and they said the police went in there and set the place on fire. We just were saying no more police brutality, and we had enough of police harassment.
And that's something we just heard time and again today, Gadi, how important trans people were to the movement that started here and how they refuse to be erased.
And what message is the Trump administration sending to the trans community with all this?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact message that he's intending to send, but hearing from people today, it seems very plain that they feel that they are not allowed to be a part of any movement that he is leading. They feel left out and like that they want to be erased and want to be forgotten. And it's not just removing the TQ plus from federal websites. It's also the executive orders that he's put forth, recognizing only two sexes, denying gender neutral markers on passports, transgender women being moved to men's prisons, banning federal funding for youth of gender affirming care for people under 19 years old. And as we've seen today, the Army saying that they're no longer going to allow trans people to join. So just one thing after another since he's taken office on January 20th that's made members of the LGBTQ plus community really feel isolated and targeted. And something we heard today is that this language really matters, and what happens with leaders really matters for how other people will treat members of the LGBTQ plus community, particularly trans people and trans young people who are already feeling like they're in a very vulnerable spot, Gadi.
Stephen Romo, thank you. Okay, for this next story, the quiet part out loud. That is the only way that I could think to describe this very upfront tactic that we're seeing play out in whatever is happening between New York's Mayor Eric Adams and the United States government. And before we get into all this drama, just watch this clip on Fox this morning where the Democrat mayor sat down shoulder to shoulder with Trump's border czar and promised to come back on that Fox show. Take a look.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
Okay, so here's the context. Today, they made that appearance together, seeming to show this united front on immigration enforcement in New York City. But today is also the day that the DOJ filed a motion to drop corruption charges against him. And in response, 7 federal prosecutors on that case straight up resigned this week, one calling it a quid pro quo situation, alleging that if the indictment against him was dismissed, then Adams would help with immigration enforcement in the city. Now, again, with all of that in mind, let's take a quick look at that again.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
Agreement we came to. So today, Eric Adams is insisting this is not quid pro quo, and NBC's Laura Jarrett has the details.
Tonight, the Justice Department officially abandoning its corruption case against New York Mayor Eric Adams. The formal motion to dismiss all charges filed by a career prosecutor in Washington after a standoff with prosecutors in New York who refused to go along. The lead attorney overseeing Adams' case in Manhattan penning a blistering resignation letter obtained by NBC News, laying into Trump-appointed DOJ brass for saying the case was distracting Adams from devoting his full attention to the president's priorities on immigration and crime. Attorney Hagan Scott in writing, no system of ordered liberty can allow the government to use the carrot of dismissing charges or the stick of threatening to bring them again to induce an elected official to support its policy objectives. Adding, if no lawyer within earshot of the president is willing to give him that advice, then I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me. As Adams now faces growing calls to step down, the pressure he faces when it comes to supporting Mr. Trump's immigration objectives on full display as the mayor and Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, appeared together this morning on Fox.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
Adams pushing back on the idea of any quid pro quo, saying tonight, "I want to be crystal clear with New Yorkers. I never offered, nor did anyone offer on my behalf, any trade of my authority as your mayor for an end to my case. Never." Still, the case touching off an upheaval within the department, with at least 7 prosecutors quitting, including those in Manhattan with sterling conservative credentials.
Laura Jarrett, thank you. Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Angela Sinandella. Angela, okay, so Eric Adams says this is not quid pro quo. How do you define quid pro quo, like legally here?
Okay, so quid pro quo literally means this for that. And there is a legal standard that was applied by the Supreme Court that stands as precedent for really any sort of a bribery or a corruption charge. And in fact, it's very ironic because it was the legal standard that the DOJ was trying to prove against Eric Adams in this bribery case, and that Eric Adams was denying also there. So the legal standard, though, is not just this for maybe that, or like maybe this or maybe that. It has to be an agreement on both sides, that both sides, whether or not it's implied or explicit, have agreed to exchange one thing for the other. So that is what Adams seems to be relying on here, saying that it wasn't an explicit or implied agreement, Gadi.
And as for the DOJ, like sinking its own case like this so publicly, so controversially, and probably knowing what was going to happen with some of these prosecutors, what's your take?
Yeah, so look, the DOJ here has done something really extraordinary, but it is clear that, look, this whole investigation and prosecution started with the former U.S. attorney who is no longer there, right? So it has certainly changed hands. But I mean, what the DOJ is doing here is once in a lifetime. You don't see this played out in public. They are disagreeing. They are trying to claim that they are an apolitical organization and they are not following marching orders. This does happen, Gadi, but it usually happens behind the scenes. We don't see this played out like this.
And one of the DOJ prosecutors who resigned over this said that in the future, DOJ charges could still be used, I believe, as leverage over the mayor. Kind of, look, if this is to be believed, it's like puppet mastering him around. Is that possible?
Yeah, so that is absolutely where just the whole ethical dilemma lies and why we saw so many resignations. So the charges here were dismissed without prejudice, and that was very clear even in Beauvais' original memo. And he even goes so far as to say he hasn't even looked at the evidence, so that's not even relevant, which does save them in the future if they do decide to refile charges, because they're saying very clearly we did not dismiss charges. We're not requesting them to be dropped based on any change in evidence. We are only doing it for these other reasons. And the other reasons that they show are, or they claim are, one, that they claim the last U.S. attorney had threatened the integrity of the prosecution. And then second, as Laura Jarrett here mentioned, that this was diverting attention and resources away from Adams' ability to address what the DOJ found to be greater concerns, which were violent crime and illegal immigration. But yes, at any time then, during the statute of limitations, the prosecutors could refile these charges, Gadi.
It feels like an episode of House of Cards. And lastly, like, I'm scared to ask this because I don't know if it has anything to do with what we're seeing, but when we were going through and we saw some of the same names, we're like, wait a minute. As I understand it, there is some overlap between the lawyers representing, or at least one lawyer representing Adams, and then people that are very close to Trump, right?
Yes, that's right. So Alex Spiro has become a very popular criminal defense attorney, and he does represent Elon Musk, and he also here is representing Adams. But in all fairness, I will say he represents a lot of famous people, including Mr. Beast and, Jay-Z. So at some level, there is always a connection, just a few degrees of separation. But it certainly does bring this all into question, Gadi.
Just like you would probably represent all of everybody at NBC if anything ever went down. Angela, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And here are some other headlines that we're watching tonight. The man charged with shooting 16-year-old Ralph Yarl 2 years ago, he has pled guilty. And 2 years ago, the black teenager accidentally rang the doorbell of Andrew Lester, who's white. Lester fired shots at Yarl several times, and the 86-year-old man accepted a plea deal today of up to 7 years in jail. And a school shooting avoided, an Indiana teen accused of plotting a mass school shooting today. Authorities say the teen allegedly had, quote, an obsession with the Parkland shooter, and they found magazines for rifles, bullets, and a soft vest inside the teen's home. The school district says the student is now in custody. And Texas is seeing one of the largest measles outbreaks in decades. Their Department of Health Services reported over 40 measles cases and at least 13 hospitalizations statewide. Most of these cases are from people who live there roughly about 6 hours west of Dallas. And Igloo is recalling over 1 million rolling coolers, and those handles of those 90s quart flip and toe coolers could, they say, potentially lead to fingertip amputation. That's according to the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission. Now, if you've bought one of those coolers, they say you should stop using them and get in contact with the company for a free replacement. And a party in Philly today, hundreds of thousands of Philadelphia Eagles fans celebrating their team's victory on Broad Street. The Super Bowl champions beat the Kansas City Chiefs 40-22. And the quarterback, Jalen Hurts, won MVP. Don't go anywhere. We are just getting started. Up next, we're learning new information tonight about what happened right before an American Airlines plane crashed with that Army helicopter. Those details are coming up, so stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. We've got some new details on what happened in the devastating mid-air crash in Washington, D.C. last month. The helicopter, that Black Hawk helicopter's black box, revealing that it was flying too high, but the pilots inside might not have even known about it. NBC News aviation correspondent Tom Costello has the latest.
2 weeks after the mid-air crash killed 67 people, NTSB investigators say the Army helicopter's black box indicates its radio altimeter showed 278 feet at the time of the crash, 78 feet above the 200-foot limit for helicopters. But the chopper pilots may not have known because their barometric altimeter may have been feeding bad data. In other words, they may have thought they're at one altitude when in truth they were at a different altitude.
It's possible, but we have a lot of work to do till we get to that.
The NTSB also says the chopper crew may not have heard a critical message from air traffic control to pass behind the regional jet.
Pass too far, pass behind this, RJ.
Because one of the chopper pilots keyed his mic over the words pass behind the. The RJ pilots may have tried to avoid the crash with a dramatic pitch up 1 second before impact. Was there any indication that the crew of the CRJ realized at the last second they might be hit?
Yes, there was an indication, and that is we see a pitch up of the aircraft, so it was 9 degrees up.
Helicopters in and around Reagan National are required to fly down Chopper Route 4, hugging the east side of the Potomac under 200 feet near DCA.
They had about 1 second between the time they realized where the helicopter was until impact, so there was no chance for them to get out of the way.
Tim Lilly is First Officer Sam Lilly's father. He also piloted regional jets and Blackhawks around D.C.
Sam's departure, he left a giant hole in our family. You just don't know how long you have with somebody you really love, and we weren't ready for him to go yet.
The NTSB says it is also looking at whether the chopper crew's vision was limited because they were wearing night vision goggles. A final report on this crash and what caused it could take up to a year. Gadi?
We're still waiting for that, though. Tom Costello, thank you. Coming up, it was a wild week from weather coast to coast. We've got more on the mudslides that are happening here in California. But first, you got to see this. This right here, now you might have already seen this. This was a humpback whale swallowing a kayaker whole. That happened in Chile. But wait, seconds later, it spits him right back out there. See, it's swallowing him. He goes in the mouth for way longer than I would have liked, and then he pops back out. Luckily, the kayaker's dad was there to help him to shore. Call him Ishmael. We'll be right back. Hey, welcome back. Last night we told you about that powerful atmospheric river that slammed us here in Southern California overnight. It brought more than just rain. It was a rare tornado that damaged nearly a dozen mobile homes in Oxnard. And the National Weather Service says a weak tornado did all of that, bringing those roofs to the ground. And this is what the aftermath looked like today. Crews trying to dig out all the excess mud and the pools of water left from that storm. And this is what things looked like last night. The rain overnight nearly swallowing entire cars, sending brown streams of water down roads. NBC's Morgan Chesky is in the storm zone with the latest.
In Malibu, a mud-covered SUV tossed surfside after a terrifying moment mid-storm. Dashcam capturing a rain-fueled torrent exploding through concrete barriers onto the Pacific Coast Highway, where it swept this SUV off the road in seconds. The debris barely missing Hector Caldera's own truck.
As soon as we start backing up to the other side, another slide, so we got trapped from both slides.
Our crew there as the driver with LA Fire climbed out shaken, but somehow safe. The close call blamed on an atmospheric river, drenching charred burn zones, flooding the Los Angeles metro area, even unleashing a rare tornado near Oxnard.
The house shook, and the noise got louder and louder, and it sounded like something hit the top of the house.
Mountains of mud lining streets beneath the Eaton Fire burn zone, where residents say the slide swallowed nearly everything in its path.
All of a sudden, you could hear the roar, and this flash flood of mud came down the street. It was horrendous.
The storm so violent, the roof of this supermarket caved in.
And I was like, oh my God, like I was scared out of my mind. It was insane.
Back in Malibu, as a crane hoisted that SUV back onto dry land, Captain Eric Scott stressing, even though the rain stopped, the landslide risk remains.
How much longer before that landslide risk ends?
Usually 48 hours is our main concern after the rain stop. But again, this is still rather tumultuous. There's a lot of burned, scarred footprints throughout Los Angeles, and we know there's more rain to come.
And tonight here outside the famed Duke's Malibu, as crews try to clean up this muddy mess, officials say those evacuation orders issued yesterday should all be expiring by the end of tonight.
Morgan Chesky, thank you. Meanwhile, here's some other stories happening out west that we're following right now. This morning, an Arizona mom was handed 3 life sentences for murdering her 3 kids. 27-year-old Rachel Henry pleaded guilty and even admitted to smothering her own kids back in 2020. Now, all 3 kids were under the age of 4. Also today, a federal judge in Seattle temporarily blocked Trump's order on banning gender-affirming care for people under 19. Now, this comes a day after a federal judge in Maryland did the exact same thing. Meanwhile, the Justice Department says the president has the authority to direct agencies to implement his agenda. And in San Diego, the U.S. Coast Guard turned up with enough cocaine to equal the weight of a full-grown humpback whale. We are talking 37,000 pounds. That's estimated to be worth about $275 million. The Coast Guard ship was away at sea for more than a month looking for drugs on missions off the coasts of Mexico and Central and South America. And still to come, there's a bridge collapse in Peru that sent a bus tumbling into a river. We've got those details and other stories trending around the world coming up next, so stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. Where the U.S. stands right now with Ukraine is becoming a very confusing question to answer. While world leaders right now are gathering in Munich to discuss how to end the world war there, the Trump administration's latest stance on Ukraine and on NATO is a very big question mark. So NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell explains.
Overnight, a Russian drone striking the Chernobyl nuclear plant. UN inspectors say no sign of a radiation release. But Russia's attacks an ongoing reminder of the war's toll on Ukraine, as world leaders gathered in Munich about peace talks to end the conflict. Ukraine's President Zelensky meeting with Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio.
We want the war to come to a close. We want the killing to stop, but we want to achieve a durable, lasting peace.
But after President Trump said this week Russian President Putin told him he wants peace, Zelensky said he told President Trump Putin is lying.
I said to him that he is a liar.
Allied leaders stunned by mixed messages from the U.S. this week. And so are multiple members of Congress here talking to NBC News from both parties, pointing to the president suggesting a summit with Putin without Ukraine. Zelensky today saying,
I will meet with Russians, with only one Russian guy, with Putin.
And critics point to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on Wednesday, ruling out Ukraine ever getting into NATO, taking a key negotiating chip off the table before talks even start.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Prompting a rare rebuke from the Republican Armed Services Chairman Roger Wicker, calling it a rookie mistake. Zelensky today saying the U.S. has always resisted NATO membership for Ukraine.
United States, they never saw us in NATO. They just spoke about it. but they really didn't want us in NATO. It's true.
Zelensky also complaining about being pressured in Kyiv by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to sign a contract giving the U.S. future rights to Ukraine's rare earth minerals to compensate for U.S. military aid.
I said that our lawyers will learn it, and then with some advices or some changes, will come back.
Tonight, Zelensky with NBC's Kristen Welker.
Can Ukraine survive without U.S. military support?
Probably it will be very, very, very difficult. And of course, in all the difficult situations, you have a chance, but we will have low chance to survive without support of the United States.
Andrea Mitchell reporting. Andrea, thank you. Let's take a quick look at what else is happening around the world today. Hamas gave the Israeli government the names of 3 more hostages that they are set to release tomorrow. In exchange, Israel plans to free more than 360 Palestinian prisoners. So now it's looking like things are back on track after a few days of not knowing whether Hamas was going to go through with the release or if the ceasefire was going to fall apart. And Pope Francis is in the hospital. He's been treated right now for bronchitis and is undergoing some tests. The Vatican says the pontiff has a slight fever and a respiratory infection. His events have been canceled over the next few days, including his Holy Mass on Sunday. And in Peru, at least 2 people were killed after a bus plunged off of a collapsed bridge. Dozens of other people were hurt. You can see the bus there caught up in that rushing water. There have been a lot of strong rainstorms in recent weeks there, but it's not clear if that's what caused the bridge to collapse. And archaeologists in London are finding quite the discovery under just an office building there. It turns out the remains of a 2,000-year-old Roman basilica was in the basement. And from the size and scope of that thing, it likely served as a town hall for an ancient Roman city as well. It apparently is one of the most substantial pieces of Roman architecture in Britain right now. And before we go, love is in the air this Valentine's Day, but so are scams, and people are losing their entire life savings. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. That story is coming up next, so stay tuned. Hey, welcome back. And here are some of the tech headlines that we're following tonight. TikTok is back on Apple and Google app stores, and it disappeared from both app stores last month when the initial TikTok ban went into effect. But TikTok came back the next day for users who had the app already downloaded on their phones, but it was unavailable for new downloads on those stores until yesterday. And according to an internal company memo, Meta is starting to develop AI-powered humanoid robots using their Llama AI technology. Those robots, they say, will someday assist consumers with physical tasks and chores around the house, maybe. The group of researchers heading up the project is led by the former CEO of Cruise self-driving cars, Mark Whitten. And Elon Musk's DOGE has been a constant presence within the U.S. government since day one of the Trump administration, with so many government agencies coming under the DOGE microscope, the Department of Education, the EPA, even this Department of State, all while Elon Musk has been wearing those T-shirts saying White House tech support. But when it comes to how secure the new DOGE website is, well, there are reports that it has some pretty critical read-write access problems, potentially leaving it open to be edited and defaced, which some people have already started to do, apparently. One person writing on the official DOGE website, these experts left their database open. Ruh-roh. Let's bring in former lead cybersecurity reporter for the New York Times and former cyber advisor to CISA, Nicole Perlroth. Nicole, thank you so much for being with us. I can imagine tech support would have been on the phone all day long for something like this. For those of you who don't code, what does this do? What was accessible? Some of this is making it sound kind of like it was Wikipedia editing in and out. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to describe it is that this DOGE website was pulling from a database that was basically accessible to anyone who wanted to go in and edit it. And so we saw, thank God, cybersecurity researchers who went in and just played around and didn't do anything particularly harmful. And it's not as if this website was directly connected to sensitive classified government systems. But I do think it speaks to this larger move fast and break things culture of Silicon Valley coming into the federal government and not doing it in sort of the secure way that a lot of these systems require. And this DOGE website's one example, but we're seeing it at Treasury. We're seeing it at OPM. We're seeing it in some of the Department of Energy systems, Treasury. So this is actually quite serious. It's just a very minimal glimpse at sort of the lack of security thinking that's going into a lot of these efforts.
I'm so glad you brought that up, the move fast, break things. There's also like the zero-based budgeting, like to cut everything back and then add in some of the, I guess, essentials after you already lost them. So many people are likening this to what happened over at Twitter, X, him walking in with the sink. And the fact that Twitter X has turned around and is still working despite all those cuts. But I think a lot of people forget about how close they came to total collapse with like the server transfer at one point, right? When you're looking at all this and knowing like the backstory on some of these move fast and break things companies, like what do you see?
Yes, Twitter is still standing. There were glitches. It survived. But every serious cybersecurity practitioner I know who was on Twitter has left the site for Blue Sky or Mastodon or one of these other sites because they know on the back end, nothing is secure. You have to remember that they basically fired a number of their security practitioners, security officials, CISOs, and we have no idea what the back end of Twitter looks like. I think when you go on Twitter these days, it really is a fire hose of bots and coordinated influence campaigns and Elon groupies, and you don't know how much the algorithm is boosting those, but we really have no visibility on what's happening on the back end. And I think what's serious here is we have had very serious cybersecurity breaches at some of these government agencies like Treasury not that long ago from Chinese state-sponsored hackers, at OPM several years ago. These agencies are targets for nation-state attacks. And I lived through those attacks and I covered them at the New York Times. And then I was there as very thoughtful people came into government to figure out how do we stop this from happening again. So it's very hard to watch what's happening now when you're seeing, literal 20-somethings with no real cybersecurity expertise. In fact, some of their background suggests they were selling data on the back end, have engaged in some nefarious practices in their previous careers, if you want to call it that, who are now just plugging their own servers into these very same systems. And there's no chance that they're not introducing security vulnerabilities. And that's really what we're seeing right here with, frankly, this, stupid DOGE website. They were basically just accessing it through this page that anyone could access and edit it. And that, I think, just speaks to the larger security risks we're seeing at these other agencies.
It was a wild, wild west before. I don't even know what it is now. Nicole Perlroth, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. And finally tonight, as a lot of people celebrate Valentine's Day, a lot of singles are still out there looking for love. And while finding it online seems to be a popular option, thousands have unfortunately fallen victim to romance scams. And the amount of money they are losing will make your heart sink. Ken Delanian shows us more.
This Valentine's Day, love is a battlefield. Love is a battlefield. For some, anyway, as Americans are increasingly falling for complex online dating scams and losing tons of money in the process. A new report from Wall Street watchdog Better Markets uncovers how scammers are using unregulated cryptocurrency to commit massive fraud. The perpetrators, experts say, often Southeast Asian crime syndicates. It's known as pig butchering.
They call it pig butchering because it's akin to fattening up a pig before slaughtering it. In this case, fattening up the victim before slaughtering its finances.
A typical operation goes like this. Scammers reach out to their mark online, posing as a made-up single and initiate a virtual romance. First stealing the victim's heart, then their bank account, manipulating them into fake investment opportunities using cryptocurrency. The victim sends a big sum of money through a fake platform, and in the blink of an eye, those funds are gone, untraceable and irreplaceable. That's exactly what happened to Barry May, a divorce insurance adjuster in Mississippi.
If I invested with her or invested in the crypto, then that she could come to me and we could get married.
His whirlwind online romance with someone he thought was named Anna ended up costing him $500,000, his entire life savings.
I got about $10,000 left in my account to my name, and I've got a daughter at home that's autistic.
Is this financial situation affecting the care that you're able to give?
Yeah, because I can't afford medicine.
Fortunately for May, a phone call from an FBI agent stopped him from taking out a loan to send even more money, putting himself even deeper in debt. The Bureau estimates there were over 40,000 victims of romance fraud in the U.S. in 2023. The combined losses are staggering.
We estimate that $4 billion is what was transferred illicitly through these scams in 2023. It's likely that the actual amount is far greater because most people don't report that they've been victims of these scams.
And it's the prevalence of cryptocurrency that's making these scams much easier.
Criminals prefer crypto really for three reasons. One, it allows them to quickly transfer money offshore without having to engage with the traditional financial system. Two, it allows them anonymity. And three, crypto transactions tend to be very difficult to trace.
Scammers using new tools to take advantage of those looking for love in all the wrong places. Ken Delanian, NBC News.
Oh, man, that was a bummer. That was a very sad story to end the show on this Valentine's Day. We love you. That's going to do it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you here on Monday. But until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.